Well, it gives me great joy to be able to be here again to spread God's word and to share it with everyone and to think about things that can motivate us to be better Christians and things that can help us to serve God in a better way and things that can confirm our faith. And it gives me great joy, particularly because I remember when I was 12 years old is when I was baptized, and that's a long, long time ago. I was a very young person to be baptized at that age, I think, but I knew what I was doing and I knew why I was doing it. And from that time on, I began to learn about things in the church and to think about how to develop myself as a Christian from that very young age. And at age 20, I remember I gave my first sermon, and it happened to be in Spanish before English, which was kind of ironic for me. But I spent a lot of time preaching in Spanish because I had just devoted myself to that. And I spent a lot of my youth actually learning to speak Spanish and to preach in it and to work with the Spanish speaking brethren, which was as much a help to me as it was for them, if not more, because I feel like I've grown so much by having done that. And now here I am preaching in English and doing a lot of preaching at a lot of different congregations around the Seattle area. So I feel like I set myself up in a personal way to be able to serve God in that way and to serve my fellow brethren. So I'm very happy that I made those decisions when I was young. So this lesson is about what can a young person do? And you know, that question of what is a young person, that's a very open question. I remember when I used to be one, and I don't know what time that stopped being the case, but at some point, we were all young, and you have to think about what do you do when you're young to serve Christ. Whether there's a lot of young people in this audience right now or not is really not important because it's understanding the importance of serving God in the youth because we all have relatives that are younger than us. We all have other people that we could share this message with. And so I thought about what are some things that we could do as a young person. And this is not about what are you allowed to do and what are you not allowed to do. You might infer from the title, this is what is a young person allowed to do. This is more about what kind of difference can a young person make? What kind of impact can they have on their environment, on the church, on their family, their friends, and everyone else around them? And so we have to think about what can a young person do because that is our point today. A lot of times they have to overcome a little bit of discrimination because young people sometimes are considered, thoughtless and frivolous in what the way they do things, and we don't give them the time of day, and we don't always dedicate enough energy and time to actually training younger people to do the right things in the church. If you don't do that, of course, what ends up happening is you have a church that does not age. It does not is not able to support itself in coming generations. And so it's a critically important function for us to do that, to have young people aware of what they can do to serve God, even from the days that they're very young. And we know that faith comes by hearing, is what it says in Romans 10, but also it gets hardened by fiery trials, things that we have to go through. And so as young people, we need to understand that as well in the beginning. Understand that faith is what starts your journey, but then you have to understand that it doesn't make it any easier just to make that commitment. It's when it actually just begins. And so we're going to talk about four individuals in the Bible and then make some applications. And these are young people. All these are young people in the Bible. And they're all famous people. And you may not even think of them as young people, but it's clear that they are when they went through some of their most formative years. So talking about Joseph, first of all, in Genesis 37 and verse 2, it says, "These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers, and he was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father." And so here you have kind of an introduction here of Joseph, and it's talking about his age, and it very explicitly states that he's a 17-year-old boy. And so that's actually a nice detail to have, because sometimes when it says a young person, we have no idea how young that is. But here we know exactly how old he was. And we know kind of what a 17-year-old boy goes through in their life. Not the same thing exactly as being a shepherd, because I don't know if there's many shepherds around here that are age 17, although there might be some. But whatever the case is, we can see in his environment what it was like to be a 17-year-old. And so actually what you see here is the beginning of the envy that started between Joseph and his brothers, because he's out there doing his job in the right way, and he comes back to the father and he reports on his brothers that they're not doing a great job out there in the field, and because they were shepherds as well. And so after he did that, here's what happened to him. His brothers later saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. So So you have to think about, there's a bunch missing there between those two quotes there, right? Because he's just basically going back to the father and say, hey, these guys are not doing what they should be doing. And now in this next verse that we read in verse 18, they're all ready to kill him. That's a pretty sad state of affairs. It reminds me a lot of Cain and Abel, right? Where Abel was doing the right thing, Cain wasn't. And Cain's reaction was, well, I'll just kill him, as if that would solve some problem. And so here's what they see. And this is the beginning not of studying about their attitude and how wrong that was, but in thinking about Joseph and what he did as a young man in that situation, because they were older than him. He was a younger brother. And so what would he do in that situation? That's what we have to think about. And we know the story very well, probably. And we know how their initial intent here was to kill him. We also know that Joseph and Reuben were the two brothers that argued against killing him. And so they basically were the only ones that seemed to be talking the other brothers out of killing him. And instead, they decided to actually sell him into slavery, which is, I don't know if that's better or not, but whatever the case is, at least they had the ability to do that. And yet, what is Joseph going to be thinking through all this? Well, you find out later in Genesis 42 Joseph's state of mind, because here's the brothers talking to each other in Genesis 42. They say to one another, "In truth, we're guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." And they're talking about a famine in later times. And so they come to the stage later where they realize that they did a horrible thing. And it describes what Joseph was going through at the time, because it talked about the distress of his soul, meaning it was an anguished feeling, meaning that it was he probably felt bereft of any help and any love in the family's area. And likewise, it says he begged us and we did not listen. So he begged them not to do an evil thing to him, and yet they still did it. And so here's a young individual who was stuck in this situation against his will completely, and he found himself there. And what is he going to do about it? What would an individual do about that? Would they become bitter against their family and against God? Would they begin to have other beliefs and look for other alternatives to try to thrive in that kind of environment? Well, we see that he didn't change very much, because here he is in that pit, and we realize that he eventually got sold as a slave to the house of someone named Potiphar, and Potiphar was somebody who worked for Pharaoh in Egypt. And so you look at it, he got put into an important house like that, and yet he had a position of servitude still. And when he was there, what we find out in the story, as we all know very well, no doubt, is that Potiphar's wife would continually make passes at him and try to get him to do things he shouldn't do as a believer in the one true God, and that she was a married woman, and Joseph had no right to her. And yet, he could very easily convince himself that it was two consenting adults, as you often hear, and he could put all kinds of rationalizations in his mind about why this might not be a bad thing. And it must have been a great temptation for him, and yet he did not fall for that temptation. And it says, talking about the wife of Potiphar, it says, as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. And so this was not a one-time thing where there was an offer made and Joseph said no. This was a continual thing. When it says day after day, that's kind of like almost a nagging, that's just throwing it out so many times. And it's hard enough, for us sometimes to resist one temptation. But how hard is it when the same temptation keeps presenting itself day after day after day? Eventually, some of us are weak and we'll fall at some point. We see here the example of Joseph as he was a super strong young man, because he's still not very old at this point. Later on, we're going to find out he turns 30 when he starts to be in charge of Pharaoh's affairs. So he's between age 17 and 30 somewhere. So let's say he's in his 20s. And if that's the case, here's a person who really has their priorities in mind and a strong faith in God despite very unpleasant circumstances, unfair circumstances. He could complain and say, why did God let this happen to me? But he doesn't do that. He serves God with all his soul. So here's what happened to Joseph. He got put into prison because she falsely accused him of the very thing she wanted him to do. And he gets put into a dungeon. And it says in Psalm 105, this is a psalm talking about Joseph at this moment in time. It says God called down famine on the land and destroyed all their supplies of food. And he sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with shackles, and his neck was put in irons. And so when you read something like that, it kind of reminds you that this is pretty serious stuff. It's not just like you're going to work for this man now. He was put into a dungeon, and apparently he was chained up, and it was not a pleasant thing for a while. So in the beginning, he had these hard situations to go through. Completely unfair, completely unjust. God saw everything that happened, and it's clear from the biblical narrative that God was making all this happen for a reason. Joseph probably had no idea what that reason was. And yet he was still able to confide in God and not lose his faith and not lose his trust in God. So when he finally does get out of prison, he was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. So when you read that, you have to understand that it means that Joseph finally came into a position of importance. But he's still in a faraway place. He's still in a place that's remote from his family. It's a different culture. They have different gods. They don't worship Jehovah there in Egypt. And so there's a whole situation here that's different. He's completely out of his element all this time from around age 17. And he's growing up in this kind of environment. And all these influences, they could be, infecting him as they day by day also tempt him. Just like Potiphar's wife was doing that, the same thing is happening with all the temptations that would be around him in Egypt. And if you don't think there would be temptations living in the house of Pharaoh or working for somebody that important, I think you don't read this very well. Because if you go into that kind of money and power and prestige, and that kind of a country, which was probably the number one country in the world in terms of GDP, if they measured it, in terms of economy, in terms of science, all these other things, that was an important place to be, and he was right at the top of it. And he was a young man. And you know what? It didn't change him. He didn't give up his faith in God. He didn't renounce anything, and he didn't change his principles. He's still the same person despite all that. What an example. Because I don't know how many of us could actually go through all that and still come out unscathed. And really, that's what we see in him. And what you see is the example that he gave. In Genesis 39, you see people looking at him when he's in jail. And it says, his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. And so he gave this example out where everyone around him saw that there was something special about this young person. And not because he himself was so great, but he says, everyone saw the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. And so people attributed it to what Joseph no doubt said, that it was God's doing. You see also in Genesis 39:23, the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, meaning he didn't have to worry about it, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Now you think about what that is. Here's God rewarding a young individual who gave his life in service to God and sacrificed many things because of his faith, and God is making sure that it goes well with him. Now, at any point in time during this early years, Joseph would probably not say that his life is going very well, because nobody would say in those situations that everything is how I planned it to be and how I wanted it. And yet, what does it say? Everything he's doing is succeeding. That's an interesting thing to read, because it's really talking about a longer term plan. It's talking about how all these small victories are piling up into one massive victory where God is showing his glory through this young individual. And it's under the very nose of the king of Egypt. Imagine that influence that he's wielding. Pharaoh himself said to one of his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? What a statement to make. Joseph had all these opportunities to choose right and to choose wrong, and he keeps choosing right in all these situations. You don't even read about any mistakes he makes along the way, really. It's almost like a perfect person. He's clearly not, but that's the impression everybody has of him, that he really is focused on doing what Jehovah God wants him to do, and they saw God through him. What an influence this young individual is bringing. And it talks, remember, where day by day he had these temptations where Potiphar's wife would come to him and ask for all this to happen, and all this time he didn't sin. He didn't sin in those ways. And so it's a tremendous thing that Joseph has done in leaving this legacy for us to read about and to think about. But now let's talk about another case. This is a girl in the Old Testament as well, and we don't even know her name. This is a young girl, a young servant girl, And so in that way, she's a little bit like Daniel because she's a servant and she's effectively a bond servant, or you might call her even a slave. In 2 Kings 5 and the first 5 verses, this is talking about the case of Naaman, which we've probably heard about Naaman the leper many times. It says, Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, Would that my lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. So Naaman went in and told his lord, Thus, thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you to Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me and cures a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me. But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. Now, this is the case of a commander in the army of the Syrians, a commander named Naaman. And here's a man who he's taken spoils from Israel and in different battles. And one of the spoils was this young girl that was taken into service and worked for his wife. She worked for Naaman's wife. And now here's a young girl that grew up in Israel, and she had faith in God, because you read how she's describing this. She's saying, I know that the man of the household here, Naaman, is a leper. And it's a terrible, terrible, tragic situation. And she didn't seem to care that it was an enemy of the people of Israel. She didn't seem to care that he was probably a violent person, having been in so many battles, that he took her captive as well. And you think about all the things that she could justify in her mind to rationalize why she should just shut her mouth and let him suffer his leprosy because he deserved it. And yet, what did she do? She had pity on him. She had mercy for him. She thought, what can I do to make this situation better? And she thought about it, and she thought, God is all powerful. And he has a prophet, Elisha, that's able to do these things through God's power. And he could heal this person. Now, how many times do you see somebody that got into trouble of their own volition and they made their own bad choices, and it's easy for us to say, well, they got what they deserved? How hard is it, on the other hand, to look at a situation like that and say, how can I make it better? How can I do something to redeem that? How can I do something to reconcile all the wrong that has been done there? And that's what this little girl was doing. She had such a heart of gold to look at that situation and think, I think God would look at this situation favorably and do something. And sure enough, he did, because when we read this full story, we see that Naaman was indeed cured of his leprosy. Now, the part of the story we often forget is, why did he know about this? Why did he know about this opportunity? It's only because of this little girl who brought up the whole thing in the first place. And so if you look at it, there's actually an interesting line of succession here, because there's a little girl that worked for Naaman's wife. Okay, and she told Naaman's wife about that. She went to her husband, who was a lord or somebody in command there. So a lord in that society, that was Naaman. She told him. Naaman went to the king of Syria and told him. Then it got back to the king of Israel because of messengers being sent back and forth. After that, it got to the prophet Elisha because the king didn't seem to care too much about it. And finally, it came to God's ears. Now you think about that succession of events there. It all started with, in very small font, that little girl right there, who seems insignificant in the whole story until you think about what really happened. You think, what can a young little girl do like that in a situation like this? And yet you see the great thing that was done by God through her. All of these things, like the king of Syria, the king of Israel, a prophet of God, all these people are it's a chain reaction that was all started by one person, one young girl. And her attitude was the right one, and her belief in God was the right one. And what could that young person do here? A tremendous thing. She saved someone from leprosy. She gave us this example. How many times have you heard sermons about Naaman the leper and how it symbolizes baptism and teaches us great things? Well, one of the things it teaches us also is the power of faith that young people can have and the effect and impact that they can have on those around them. And so just like Joseph had that great influence and everybody saw God through him, they saw it through this young girl too. And you might think that she doesn't have the same opportunities as a Joseph, and yet look at the great things that happened. All because God blessed her because she trusted in God. And so we can see that it's another example of how a young person can have a great and tremendous influence. Also in the Old Testament, you find the story of Daniel and his three friends. In Daniel, you have to understand that they were in a time where they were taken into Babylon captivity, not Assyrian, like the one we just read about. In this case, they're taken. All of Judah is taken into Babylon captive, and Daniel and three of his friends are perceived to be very teachable, and they look like they could become very, key citizens in the Babylonian culture. And so they were set apart from all the other captives and all the people they brought from the war, and they were brought into the king's palace, and they were meant to be educated in the king's way. Just like Joseph, that spent a lot of time in Pharaoh's court, you find people now that are in the court of the king of Babylon. And these also are young people. And they wanted to feed them with very fine food because they wanted them to grow up with the best of everything and train them and model them after the Babylonian society when they were really Hebrews at heart, right? That's where they came from. And so you see Daniel resisting to eat all of the fancy food that they brought to them. In Daniel 1:8 it says, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And so here's Daniel realizing that he's a Hebrew. He has a law of dietary restrictions from God. He has all these reasons to not become heavily invested in the culture of Babylon, but to remember his heritage as God's people. And he doesn't want to do everything that would push him away from God and more towards Babylon. And he realizes apparently that having this more delectable plate of food that came from the king's table, is how it's described, that could be a pleasant thing to have. That would be a pretty nice thing to have in those times. And yet he thought, I would rather just not have that. I'll sacrifice that because I want to remember who I am. I don't want to be lost and submerged into a culture that's not my own and a culture that's not good for me. And so all throughout Daniel, you see this attitude. And this is how it began when he was a young person trying to be brought up in that way. In chapter 3 of Daniel, you see King Nebuchadnezzar makes an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And so here's Nebuchadnezzar erecting this massive image that's golden and shiny, and it's like an 8 or 9 story building. That's how high it is. It's not just a little image you could fit in this room. This is a massive structure. And Nebuchadnezzar wanted everybody to go out there, and he made a big fanfare about it with all kinds of musical instruments and processionals. And he told everybody, when you hear this music, you need to fall down and worship this statue that I've put out here. Now, what do you think Daniel would do in that situation? A young person, they would probably feel like, well, not much I can do. I'm between a rock and a hard place here because, what can I do? I'll be in big trouble if I don't do that. And yet, Daniel and his three friends, despite all the threats placed against him, did not do that. They didn't fall down and worship that image. And so we know what happens after that. It says, Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought, and they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I've set up? And so these three friends of Daniel's, they're also not worshiping this, and they're singled out for punishment. And we know what happens in the story, that they're thrown into this fiery furnace, and God miraculously preserves their lives. And yet, what we have to understand here is that these are all young people making hard decisions and courageous ones. And all of the things around them tell them to just take it easy, go with the flow. Whatever Babylon tells you to do, they're the powerful ones. They're the ones that have all the power over you. You're nothing compared to them. And so it'd be very easy for them to try to blend into that and thrive in that culture. And yet, what you see instead is they're thriving spiritually. By avoiding that culture and not immersing themselves in it and not buying everything that's being told to them, but actually relying on God, they're surviving that way. They're surviving spiritually. And it's a big difference to see something like that. And so when you see that, what is their answer? If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. And so you see a very strong answer from these young people where they're professing their faith before the king of Babylon. Think about how they're addressing him. They've been singled out for all these benefits, and they're living off the king's table, supposedly. The king wanted them to have every privilege and every benefit, and they're saying, you know what? If it means we have to serve idols to get this, we don't want it. Now think about what a commitment that is to make as a young person. How easy is it to just say, I can have an easier life if I don't worry about my spiritual side? If I just decide that other things matter to me more because I can serve God as, whenever I have time and whatever way I decide, but these other things will make my life easy. Clearly they didn't take the easy road here. They didn't take what was going to make the most sense for them from a self-preservation point of view in terms of our physical life. Instead, they thought about their spiritual life, which mattered so much more. So lastly, let's talk about Timothy, and then we'll make a few applications. Timothy is another young man. This time we're in the New Testament. And here in Acts chapter 14, at least, we see that Paul is in the city of Antioch. And he's traveling from Antioch to Iconium to other places on his missionary journey. And a bunch of Jews had followed him, and they persuaded the crowds. They stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing he was dead. So now here's Paul being stoned at a city called Lystra. Or he actually fled to Lystra. It says, Paul came also to Derbe and Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer. And it starts to talk about his background and how his mother and his grandmother had devout sense of spirituality, and they believed in God and they trusted in God. And it clearly had an effect on this young person named Timothy. And here you have Timothy, who is in this city where Paul is just fleeing from being stoned and left for dead, and he's coming into Timothy's place. And what is Timothy going to think? He might think, well, here's a person on the run because the authorities want him. Here's a person who they're trying to kill. Most people would say, I better not be associated with him. I don't want any guilt by association. I don't want to have the same problems that person is having. And yet Timothy had so much spirituality inculcated in him that he looked at the situation and he saw, here's a spiritual man who's suffering things and doing great things at the same time. And I can be like him. And so Paul had this influence on Timothy, and Timothy knew that he could do something great. And it talks about how Timothy accompanied him. It says Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews. And it talks about how they went their way through the cities, and they talked about all the things they needed to do to serve God. And so that's why Paul could write later on in 1 Timothy 4, let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. And so here's Timothy, who looked at a situation that would have been scary for any of us, and he dove right into it, and he accepted the risk, and he accepted that knowing that this was the right thing to do. It's a courageous thing for a young person to do, a decision that not all of us would make, especially not as young people. So we've looked at all these cases here, and the only thing we haven't really thought about is ourselves. What does that mean for us? Because that's the application. You go to a movie theater or something and you walk out and you don't think about what was the lesson in that for me? What did I learn from that? That was just entertainment. And this is not just entertainment. We don't read these stories like you would read a novel just to follow a plot and to feel satisfied about it. These stories are meant to tell us that there is power available to any person of any age, even young people, when they serve God. Great power. And that's what we really want to understand. So, we could ask ourselves, what would it be like if we lived in those times? Our times are different. Many times we don't think we have the same things. We don't think that these apply to us because culture is so different now than it was back then. You know what? It's really not that different. There's still idolatry all around us. You don't see idols necessarily erected over all parts of the city, But you see people that have idols in their heart, right? They serve other things than God Almighty. All of they do service to fame and power and pleasure and many things. That's the idols that people are being pushed to worship. And what does it happen? It's just like in Babylon. The vast majority fall down and worship that big idol. They do the same thing all around us throughout our society and our culture. And so we all have to take a stand as Christians and realize that that's not our place. Our place is to serve the one true God regardless of the cost. Even if it means we're going to suffer something, even if it means our life will be more difficult, those are the kind of commitments that God expects of everyone, even a young person. And so a young person has all these advantages. I remember some young preachers when I was growing up, how they decided to make a commitment to become a preacher, and I thought, well, that's an honorable thing to do. And then only as I'm starting to get a little bit older, I realized what a sacrifice that was that they made. Because you can make a lot more money, you can have a lot more easy life doing other things, and yet they didn't choose their profession for that reason. They became preachers because they wanted to save souls, and they wanted to do the right thing for God's kingdom. And so there's people that are even young, and they make that kind of decision, and they think not only about what's going to benefit me personally in terms of making my life fairly easy. They think something higher. They think of a higher purpose, and God is the one that wants to work through us. And if they're willing to accept that, then great. That's the way it works. You look at how the culture was trying to be, in these stories we read about, the culture was almost forced down the throat of these people that we were talking about, especially in the case of Daniel and the people in Babylon, because they were giving them science classes and all kinds of learnings, and they wanted them to become Babylonians and even forget they were Hebrews. That's why they gave them those other names. You know, they had Hebrew names, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were Babylonian names that they just threw on them. And so they were really trying to change their personality, their identity, and everything about them and make them like the world around them. And yet they were able to resist it. And that's the lesson for us. You know, even in a society like that, we have to be able to resist it. Now, in our case, you send kids to school. I've been through school myself a lot, and a lot of probably everybody here has been through school. And you go to school, and what do they tell you? Well, they'll start to tell you about where things came from. They'll tell you about how the world came from nothing and it evolved into what we know today. They skip a whole lot of parts about there being a creator. They don't want to think about that, and they think of every possible alternative explanation. And what are they trying to do by that? They're trying to take young people and say, here's the science we want you to know. This is the way you need to think. This is this is the truth. That's what they're telling you. As young people and even as older people, we've got to be smarter than that. We can't just take what's thrown at us and cram down our throats and say, okay, well, if that's what they say, it must be true. We have to think spiritually about things. There's no spiritual thought in saying that everything evolved from nothing. That's a purely materialistic approach to understanding the nature of things. We can understand science, and it's great to know that, and nothing against science. But when it supplants God's power and his authority and his right as the creator, that's when it's a problem. Because if it takes our mind away to some other place and says, I'm not his creation anymore, I'm just a pile of chemicals, biological ones, where's the morality in that? Where is the future in that? Where's the hope in that? You know, it's much more than that, and the scriptures want us to believe that. And the right time to make those conclusions in your mind is when you're a young person. Because the older you get, the harder it becomes to make the right choices because you've just spent so many years building up wrong ideas in your mind and your heart. And so the earlier we can get those earthly things out of our mind and focus on the spiritual things, the better it will be for all of us. And so the best thing we can do is, as young people, make that strong public commitment to become a Christian. Be like these people we just read about. Don't be afraid to be baptized. Don't be afraid to lead something in a public service if you're able to do that. Don't be afraid to do anything for God and for Christ. Don't be afraid of the world. Don't fear anything because God Almighty is on our side and he wants us to do those things. He wants us to be true believers that show it not only in our words but also in our actions, in the way we feel, the way we treat others. That's what God wants from us. And all of those things are possible from an adult or from a young person. And so the sooner we understand that, the better we are. So I would say the goal for all of us should be at whatever age we are, figure out how we can serve God better in all those ways. If this is a lesson that resonates with you, I hope that it does. Please let us know if we can serve you in any way. We always offer the gospel invitation for anyone who'd like to be baptized, and we also offer the prayers of this congregation if you feel like you would like that. So we're here to serve you in any way we can. At this time, we'll stand and sing the song that's been selected.